Just a nurse playing detective. That was what Dr. Hargrove said when he found her reorganizing the medication storage room at 11:13 p.m. on a Tuesday. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song, steady and indifferent. Brooke Sullivan didn't look up from the shelves. She didn't flinch. She didn't even pause in her work. Her hands continued moving with the precision of someone who had assembled field medical kits in darkness, who had sorted medications by priority under fire. Her fingers traced the inventory numbers, cross-referencing against the electronic system on the tablet mounted to the wall. She had been a nurse at Mercy General in Norfolk for 14 months now, and in that time she had become the kind of person people forgot about the moment they left a room. Dr. Hargrove didn't know that was intentional. She was tall without being imposing, thin without looking fragile, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that never came loose no matter how long her shift ran. Her scrubs were always wrinkled from moving between patient rooms, always slightly damp from spilled fluids and sweat. She wore long sleeves even in summer, even when the hospital's ancient air conditioning failed in July and the ER felt like the inside of a furnace. Under those sleeves were scars. Fine white lines across her knuckles. A thin rope-like mark that ran from her left wrist to her elbow. She had never explained them to anyone. No one had ever asked. Her eyes were the color of wet slate, the kind of eyes that looked straight through you without really seeing you, the eyes of someone trained to assess and catalog and move on. She moved through the corridors of Mercy General like a ghost, silent in her white sneakers, barely visible against the beige walls and the chaos of the trauma center. This was exactly how Brooke wanted it. Room 404 had been her reason for transferring to Mercy General in the first place, though no one knew that. A Marine general named Marcus Hendricks had been admitted 3 weeks ago with complications from an old IED wound, a chest injury from Ramadi that had supposedly healed 8 years ago but had never really been right. The hospital had called her previous employer looking for references about her nursing credentials, and the staffing agency had told them she was reliable and quiet and asked no questions. They had been right about all of it. What they didn't tell them was that she had spent 8 years making sure no one ever found her. That she had changed her name from what it used to be. That the last person in the world she expected to see in a hospital bed was the commanding officer who had pinned medals on her son's chest in a ceremony she wasn't allowed to attend. Dr. Hargrove was still standing in the doorway, watching her. She could feel it without looking. His presence was the kind that demanded attention, expensive cologne mixed with antiseptic, the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His shoes were polished to an impossible shine. His watch was a Rolex. Everything about him broadcast that he had never worked a double shift in his life, had never held someone's hand while they died, had never made a decision that meant the difference between living and bleeding out in a trauma bay. Just a nurse playing detective, he said again, his voice carrying the particular contempt of someone who had learned it early and practiced it often. That's exactly the kind of curiosity that causes problems in a well-run department. Brooke turned to look at him then. Not in response to the insult, but because she had finished the section she was working on and it made sense to turn. Her face was composed, jaw level, shoulders relaxed, eyes empty of reaction. She had learned to do this years ago, in a place where any visible emotion was a liability. She had gotten very good at it. I'm reorganizing the supply inventory, Doctor. The system wasn't catching duplicate orders. Her voice was quiet. Not soft, exactly, but quiet in the way that things are quiet in libraries or before storms. I found 3 duplicate shipments of foot pumps and 2 duplicates of microbore tubing over the past 6 months. Approximately $4,000 worth of equipment. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that told her she had made a mistake. Dr. Hargrove's face didn't change, but his hand tightened on his clipboard. His jaw clenched once, a micro-expression, barely visible. But visible to someone who had been trained to read the body language of men about to make terrible decisions. That's interesting, he said, and the way he said it wasn't interesting. It was the way a predator says interesting when it has spotted prey that is both wounded and too slow to run. That's very interesting, Sullivan. Because I'm the one who authorizes those orders. I'm the one who maintains the inventory system. And I'm pretty sure I didn't ask you to audit my department. I wasn't auditing. I was organizing. Brooke turned back to the shelves. She pulled down another box, Ringer's lactate, 1-liter bags, case of 20. She began removing them one by one, checking the lot numbers against her list. Each movement was practiced, economical. She didn't waste motion. She never had. The previous system was difficult to track. Items were shelved out of order. It seemed more efficient to reorganize. Efficiency. Dr. Hargrove moved further into the supply room. His footsteps were louder than hers. Everything about him took up space. That's a nice way to describe sticking your nose into departmental operations that have nothing to do with your job. Your job is to insert fours and take vital signs and wipe brows. Not to count inventory. Not to notice things. Not to think. He was right, in a way. Her job, the job she had been hired for, the job listed on the paperwork, was exactly that. She was supposed to be invisible. Compliant. The kind of nurse that doctors like Hargrove didn't remember after their shifts ended. But Brooke had also been a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy. That rank didn't disappear just because the Navy had ordered her to. She didn't say this out loud. She would never say it out loud again. That woman was dead. The Navy had erased her after Ramadi went sideways, after 3 senators needed someone to blame and someone to disappear. The Navy had taken her name and her medals and her identity and had told her in a series of official documents that if she ever surfaced, if she ever spoke about what she had seen or what she had done, there would be consequences. Legal consequences. Professional consequences. Family consequences. So that woman had died. And Brooke Sullivan had been born, quiet, deferential, the kind of nurse who kept her eyes down and asked no questions. It was easier that way. "You're right, doctor," she said. She placed the Ringer's lactate on the shelf with the other 4 fluids, each one perfectly aligned, labels facing forward. "I apologize. I was overstepping." "Damn right you were." He was closer now. Close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the expensive aftershave he used to cover the smell of the sweat that accumulated under his surgical collar during his shift. Close enough that she understood this was part of what he was doing, using proximity as a tool. Making her uncomfortable. Testing to see if she would flinch. Those orders are part of a complex purchasing system that you don't understand. Equipment gets ordered in batches, Sullivan. Sometimes it overlaps. Sometimes we have to place duplicate orders to secure the best pricing. That's not something a floor nurse needs to worry about. Brooke didn't flinch. She didn't move closer to the shelves. She didn't move away. She simply continued her work, maintaining the careful distance between them, the distance of a professional relationship that was firmly hierarchical and entirely professional. "I understand, doctor. I won't touch the inventory system again. See that you don't." He paused. She could feel him looking at her, trying to determine if she was being insubordinate or merely compliant. The two could be difficult to distinguish. "Actually, I want to ask you about something." The general in room 404. "You requested his care assignment specifically. Why is that?" This was the second mistake. This was the one she had miscalculated. She had known asking for General Hendrick's care rotation would raise questions. She had asked anyway, because seeing his name on the admission list had felt like finding an old friend's name on a casualty list. Because 8 years of pretending to be someone else suddenly felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Because her son who had graduated from high school without her at the ceremony, who had served his first deployment without her knowledge of the details, who had called her once from FOB Shank with a voice she almost didn't recognize, her son was under that man's command. "He's a complicated case," she said, and this was true. The IED wound had never healed correctly. There were adhesions, scarring. His mobility was limited. His lung capacity was compromised. She could read his chart the way some people read novels. "I thought it might be helpful to have continuity of care." Helpful to whom? Dr. Hargrove's voice had taken on a different quality. Not quite hostile. Not yet. But something underneath, something that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped 5 degrees. Because my concern is that you're thinking about this case in ways that aren't appropriate for a floor nurse. Ways that suggest you might have some kind of connection to the patient. And I need to know if that's the case, because if there's a conflict of interest, we need to address it now. There wasn't a conflict of interest. There was a secret. There was 8 years of erasure. There was the knowledge that General Hendricks was the last surviving link to a version of Brooke Sullivan that the United States Navy had officially declared non-existent. There's no conflict, she said. She turned to face him. She made sure her voice was level, her eyes empty. She had practiced this. She had practiced it every day for 8 years. I simply noticed the case when I was reviewing new admissions. It seemed interesting from a medical perspective. Trauma complications over an extended timeline. I thought I could provide good care. Dr. Hargrove studied her for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. One of them flickered slightly, a microsecond hiccup in the current that made the light stutter like a dying pulse. Well, you can't, he said finally. I'm reassigning room for 04 to Jennifer Chen. You're taking over the trauma rotation in Bay 3 instead. And Sullivan? I don't want you in that supply room again unless I explicitly assign you to inventory duty. Clear. Clear, Doctor. He left. His footsteps receded down the corridor, the sound of his expensive shoes on the linoleum fading until she was alone again with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and the weight of 8 years pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Brooke stood very still for a moment. Then she reached up and adjusted one of the 4 pumps on the shelf. It was already in the correct position. She adjusted it again anyway, a small act of control, a small act of pretending that she could organize something in her life beyond the medications and fluids that filled these shelves. After a moment, she pulled out the tablet and began updating the inventory log. The work was soothing. The numbers made sense. The organization had a logic that the rest of her life no longer possessed. She had been assigned to care for a patient she had known in another life, and in less than 5 minutes, that patient had been taken away from her. She had been threatened, obliquely, professionally, but threatened nonetheless. She had been reminded that her place in this hospital, in this life, was exactly at the bottom of the hierarchy. Invisible. Compliant. No questions asked. She should have expected this. She had been a nurse for 14 months now, and this was how it always went. The moment she tried to be anything other than invisible, the moment she tried to do anything other than accept the system as it was, consequences arrived. Sometimes they arrived as reassignments. Sometimes they arrived as something worse. But that wasn't the worst part of it. The worst part was that somewhere in room 404, a Marine general lay in a hospital bed. And he was still the man who had commanded her son in Ramadi. He was still the man whose judgment had shaped every deployment her son had made. He was still connected to a part of her life that she had been ordered to forget. And now he was going to be cared for by someone else. Brooke continued organizing the shelves long after Dr. Hargrove had left. She worked through the rest of her shift, through the chart reviews and patient rounds and the endless small tasks that made up a floor nurse's day. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. But she had learned, 8 years ago in Ramadi, that being good at your job was sometimes not enough to protect you from the decisions of men like Dr. Hargrove. Men who saw only what they wanted to see. Men who couldn't imagine that the quiet woman organizing their supply room had once done something that changed the course of history. Men who had no idea that they were standing next to someone who had been officially declared dead. The general's son arrived at 4:15 on a Tuesday, still wearing his dress blues from the drive up from Lejeune. Captain Marcus Sullivan stood at the window of room 404, hands clasped behind his back in that peculiar way Marines have when they're trying not to break something. His commanding officer lay in the hospital bed, the man who had pinned his first meritorious promotion on his chest 2 years ago. The man who had kept him alive in Helmand Province when an ambush turned a routine patrol into 3 hours of sustained fire. Brooke moved through the room like she always did, like she was part of the wall fixtures and the beeping monitors. Her hands were steady as she reached for the blood pressure cuff. The general's wound site on his left anterior chest was showing signs she didn't like: increased serous drainage, the kind that whispered about complications developing in the darkness beneath the bandage. She had seen this before, in a field hospital where the electricity ran on a generator borrowed from a marine convoy and the floor was concrete stained with things that wouldn't wash out. Dr. Hargrove swept into the room at 4:22 with 2 residents trailing behind him like remora fish following a shark. His cologne preceded him, something expensive and aggressively masculine that didn't quite cover the smell of the coffee he'd been drinking all afternoon. He glanced at the blood pressure monitor where Brooke's hands remained steady, checking the numbers again because the first reading suggested something worth verifying. "Still taking vitals, Sullivan?" His voice carried the particular edge of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "Most competent nurses finish this in 3 minutes. I suppose we can't all be efficient." The silence that followed was the kind that made the fluorescent light seem loud. One measured breath. That's what her combat training had taught her: one breath, then respond. Brooke's voice came out soft, clinical, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that authority didn't require volume. His wound site required additional assessment, doctor. The drainage has increased by approximately 15 milliliters since this morning. Hargrove turned to Captain Sullivan with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. The general's son stood absolutely still, his jaw working in that way it did when he was processing information about his CO. Hargrove spread his hands in a gesture of full sympathy. "You'll have to forgive her. She's very thorough. Perhaps too thorough. We call her the statue because she moves about as fast as one." The residents laughed on cue, the kind of laughter that felt like permission. Like they had just been told it was acceptable to mock someone who couldn't defend herself. "Isn't that right, Sullivan? The statue fits you perfectly." Brooke finished recording the vital signs without looking up from the chart. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from pain, not from sadness, but from the peculiar pressure of holding in something larger than grief. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the monitor. Her voice when she spoke again was the same measured tone, unchanged, unbroken. "I'll have the updated assessment on your desk in 10 minutes, doctor." Nothing more. There was something in that statement that made even Hargrove pause, some quality in her restraint that suggested he had missed something. But his need for dominance overrode whatever instinct might have whispered a warning. He left the room trailing residents like a parade, never once looking back. Captain Sullivan remained at the window. He did not speak to his mother because he did not know she was his mother. He did not know that the quiet woman in scrubs had held him as a newborn in a hospital in Norfolk, had taught him to walk in a house that still smelled like his father's cologne, had watched him board a bus for basic training with dry eyes and a breaking heart. He knew only that his commanding officer was safe, and that the nurse was competent, and these 2 facts occupied the entirety of his awareness. 3 days later, Brooke sat in the break room during her lunch hour with a sandwich she had made that morning and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm sitting in her locker. The room held for other nurses, their voices bright and layered with the kind of camaraderie that emerged when certain people weren't present. Dr. Martinez sat across from her, scrolling through her phone. Nurse Chen occupied the corner chair. Rodriguez was refilling her water bottle from the cooler. Brooke opened her sandwich. The conversation stopped like someone had cut the power. Not gradually, all at once. A collective inhale and then nothing. Dr. Martinez stood abruptly, her chair scraping backward with a sound like nails on tile. "Just remembered. I need to check on that consult. The GI patient in for 12. No such consult existed. Brooke knew this because she checked the board every morning and every evening. But she said nothing as Dr. Martinez left the room. Chen followed 45 seconds later, muttering about charting deadlines. Rodriguez drained her water in 3 mechanical gulps and made her exit without making eye contact. She ate her sandwich alone in a room that still held the ghost of their presence, the warmth of their coffee cups, the faint echo of their voices, the accusation of their retreat. The wall-mounted television played muted news footage of a storm system developing in the Atlantic, low-pressure systems and wind speeds and predictions of flooding in coastal areas. Brooke finished her sandwich and cleared her trash. She could feel the weight of professional isolation settling on her shoulders like a mantle, the kind of weight that accumulated in units where someone had been identified as a threat to the hierarchy. The formal write-up appeared on the unit board during shift change on Thursday afternoon. It was posted where every nurse passed at least twice per shift, positioned at eye level, impossible to miss. The paper was crisp and official, printed on hospital letterhead with Hargrove's signature at the bottom in ink the color of dried blood. R.N. Sullivan, written warning for failure to follow chain of command. Patient care decisions must be cleared through attending physician. Further violations will result in immediate termination. Beneath it, in red pen, aggressive and handwritten, this means you, Sullivan. Nurse Jen whispered to Nurse Rodriguez as they both read it, their voices low enough that they thought Brooke wouldn't hear. What did she even do? Rodriguez shook her head, the motion heavy with implications. Asked too many questions about the equipment orders, I heard. You know how paranoid Hargrove gets about anyone looking at his requisitions. The conversation continued without Brooke around her, as if she had become transparent. As if the moment they posted her failure publicly, she had ceased to be a person and became instead a cautionary tale, the woman who had asked the wrong questions of the wrong doctor and now existed in professional purgatory. That evening, Hargrove found her in the supply room as she was restocking crash cart medications. He moved with the casual precision of someone who knew he held all the power in the interaction. His presence made the small room feel smaller, like the air pressure had somehow changed. He leaned against the medication cabinet with one shoulder in a gesture designed to appear relaxed while being anything but. You think you're clever, playing detective with my requisitions? His voice was low, conversational, more dangerous for its absence of volume. You're just a nurse, Sullivan. A competent one, maybe, but just a nurse. You stay in your lane or I'll make sure you never work in this city again. I have 5 hospitals on speed dial. One phone call and your career becomes whatever you make of it in Portsmouth. You understand me? Brooke's hands were steady as she inserted a vial of epinephrine into its designated slot. Her voice came out barely audible, the way it did when she was accessing some deeper reserve of composure. I'm here to care for patients, doctor. Nothing more. But her hands shook as she walked away, and she knew he saw it. That night, Brooke drove to the cemetery where her husband lay buried under a granite marker that listed only his name and dates. The rain had started by the time she arrived, a preliminary drizzle that would become something much heavier by midnight. She stood in her scrubs, still damp from a 12-hour shift, and felt the weight of everything she could not say, could not claim, could not become. The next morning, the superstorm warning scrolled across every electronic surface in Mercy General. Red banner. All caps. Mandatory staffing. Hospital administrator emails about emergency protocols and backup generator testing. By 6 o'clock that evening, the sky had turned the color of old concrete and the rain had begun with the kind of intention that suggested it meant to stay. Brooke was checking the general's oxygen saturation at 7 o'clock when she noticed his breathing had shifted. Decreased breath sounds on the left side. The kind of subtle change that most nurses would file under monitor and reassess. The kind of change that would have triggered immediate intervention in a field hospital where the difference between catching something early and catching it late often determined whether someone walked out or was carried out. Captain Sullivan arrived for evening visiting hours at 7:15, this time in dress blues, home on leave from his own deployment. Brooke worked around him with the kind of unconscious efficiency that came from moving through spaces where people didn't quite see you. He did not know that the quiet woman taking his commanding officer's vitals had taught him to tie his shoes on a kitchen floor 23 years ago. He did not know that her call sign in Ramadi had been Reaper because she had brought back 37 Marines from the edge of death. At 9:47, the power failed. The fluorescent lights died like a switched-off radio. Emergency lighting kicked in and cast the world in shades of red, like looking through a thermal scope. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse screamed, the kind of sound that comes when control evaporates. The backup generators engaged 40 seconds later. Brooke heard their mechanical hum, felt the slight current change in the monitors. And then, at exactly 9:53, they sputtered and failed. The general's monitor went dark. Brooke pulled a small lead penlight from her pocket, a habit from 8 years of field medicine where hospitals ran on generators borrowed from supply convoys and power was a luxury. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory buried so deep it doesn't require thought. She checked the general's pupils. His lips were turning dusky. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. His son gripped her arm. "What's happening to him?" Brooke's voice dropped an octave, carrying a tone of absolute authority that made Captain Sullivan release her immediately. Not a request. A command. His lung is collapsing. Get me the crash cart. Now. The superstorm warning scrolled across every monitor at 1800 hours, red text against black screens, evacuation protocols flashing like emergency sirens. Mercy General's administrator announced the lockdown over the intercom, her voice tight with containment procedures. Brooke watched from the med cart as nurses began securing equipment, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in training but never in blood. The general lay in room 404, his eyes tracking her movements across the hallway even as doctors assured him the backup systems were state-of-the-art. She knew better. She'd worked in field hospitals where the power never came back. By 2100 hours, rain hammered the windows like fists demanding entry. The fluorescent lights flickered once. Twice. The backup power system hummed, that low electrical growl that sounded like it was working until the moment it wasn't. Brooke had just finished her medication count when the third flicker came. This one lasted longer. Residents whispered at the nursing station, checking phones, testing hallway lights that still functioned. The hospital's backup generators should have engaged automatically. Should have. In Ramadi, the should-haves were what killed people. The power grid collapsed at 2147 hours. Darkness swallowed the 4th floor like water closing over a stone. Not emergency darkness, the kind with red exit signs and backup strips along the floor, but the thick, complete absence of light that comes when systems fail in cascade. Someone screamed. Maybe the overhead intercom, maybe a patient. Brooke couldn't tell which. The darkness felt like a pressure against her skin, like standing in a room with no oxygen. Her hands moved anyway, muscle memory reaching for the penlight in her pocket. The beam cut through black like a blade. Nurses ran past her in both directions, their voices climbing. Get to trauma. Get all the portable units. Someone called a code, but the intercom was dead so it echoed through the darkness like a ghost announcement. A resident stood frozen in the hallway, his phone flashlight illuminating nothing useful. Brooke moved past him toward room 404. The general's door was closed. Through the small window, she could see the darkness inside broken only by the red indicator lights of monitors still running on battery backup. The monitors' beeping had turned frantic. Higher. Faster. She pushed into the room. The general lay rigid in the bed, his chest heaving with effort that wasn't producing breath, the kind of gasping that meant air was moving but going nowhere. His trachea would be deviating. His jugular veins would be distending. All the signs of a tension pneumothorax developing from his IED wound, the one that had collapsed his right lung when pressure built up in his chest cavity with no way to escape. Without decompression, he had minutes. Not 10. Not 5. Minutes that were already ticking like a countdown timer in a room without electricity. "I'm here," Brooke said. Just those words. Her voice had dropped an octave without her permission, the kind of voice that came from somewhere deeper than deferential nurse protocol. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who diagnosed tension pneumothorax in a field hospital lit by battery-powered headlamps while mortars fell outside the wire. The general's son wasn't in the room. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 72. Dropping. 71, 70. His lips were already losing color, the oxygen starvation moving upstream from his extremities toward his brain. His eyes found hers and held them, not begging, not panicked, but waiting. The kind of waiting soldiers learned when they understood that the person in front of them was their only chance at breathing again. Brooke pulled the penlight from her pocket and let its beam play across his chest, across his ribcage, rising and falling in that useless rhythm. Her hands already knew what she would find. 8 years of muscle memory stood up inside her like a ghost stepping back into her body. She knew the landmarks. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She knew how to find the anatomy under skin and bone and trauma tape. She knew that in this darkness, with this equipment, with this man's oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, there was only one way his brain stayed alive. The crash cart rolled in at 2,149 hours, a nurse pushing it through the darkness with a penlight between her teeth. But in the chaos and the blackout, the chest decompression kit wasn't on it. Oxygen masks without a bag. Medications without the needle gauges needed to deliver them. Equipment scattered like someone had sorted it in the dark and guessed. Dr. Hargrove pushed into the room behind the cart, his voice shrill and cracking. "What's the status? Someone tell me what's happening." His flashlight beam swung across the general's face, across Brooke's hands, across the monitor displaying oxygen saturation at 68 and falling. Brooke didn't answer him. She opened the 4-supply drawer and her fingers found the large-bore catheter, 14 gauge, the kind designed for rapid infusion but perfect for this. She already had the knife in her other hand. The small folding knife she'd carried since Ramadi, the one she'd sworn she'd never need again, the one that had saved lives in places where sterile technique was a concept and survival was the only protocol that mattered. The blade was dull from years in her pocket, but it was sharp enough for what came next. "Sullivan, what are you doing?" Hargrove's voice rose, lost its institutional authority, became something small and panicked. "You are not authorized to." She was already counting ribs. Finding the landmark. Prepping the skin with an alcohol wipe that turned dark in the penlight's beam. Her movements had the terrible precision of something rehearsed not in classrooms but in places where the cost of getting it wrong was watching someone die. The general's oxygen saturation was 65. His gasping was becoming shallower. His son, Brooke realized then that his son must be somewhere in the hallway, must be watching this unfold through the doorway, stared in the kind of frozen horror that came from seeing your commanding officer suffocate. Brooke positioned the catheter at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She could feel Hargrove's presence behind her like heat, like pressure building the way pressure was building in the general's chest. "Doctor, he'll be dead before the surgical team arrives." She said it flat. Informational. The way someone states a fact about weather. Hargrove screamed, "If you insert that catheter, I'll have you arrested for assault. You are practicing medicine without a license." His words came fast, stacked on top of each other, the voice of someone watching control slip away and trying to grab it back with threats and protocol. One measured breath. Brooke inserted the needle. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and undeniable, the sound of pressure releasing, of a pneumothorax deflating, of a chest cavity finding equilibrium. The general's body relaxed visibly, his rigid muscles releasing tension like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His breathing eased. Color returned to his lips. His oxygen saturation climbed, 70. 75, 82. 88. She held pressure on the catheter and kept her voice steady and low. "Stay with me, General. You survived worse than this. Breathe with me. In. Out." The voice of someone who talked Marines through the moment between death and the next breath 100 times over, someone who understood that the body responded to authority spoken with absolute certainty. Hargrove was already backing out of the room, his phone already in his hand, his voice venomous. "I'm calling the board president. And the police. She's done. She is absolutely done." He didn't look at the general. Didn't look at the monitor showing oxygen saturation climbing. Didn't acknowledge that the man in the bed was breathing again. He moved like something focused on a single objective, the elimination. Within the hour, his network activated with the precision of a machine long-willed and waiting for activation. The hospital board president's personal line rang at 2,227 hours while she was eating dinner, Hargrove's voice urgent, accusatory, citing assault and unauthorized practice. The staffing agency that had placed Brooke received a formal complaint at 2,241 hours, a documented incident that made her employment status instantly precarious. A hospital investigator arrived at 2,256 hours with security personnel, and they didn't move immediately. They waited until the shift change, until the hallway was crowded with day shift nurses arriving for the 2,300 briefing, until the maximum number of staff could witness what came next. But that wasn't the worst part. The investigator arrived while the hallway was still crowded with day shift nurses arriving for the 2,300 briefing, their arrival synchronized with precision that made Brooke's stomach drop. She'd seen this choreography before, in military ops, in carefully orchestrated takedowns. This wasn't accidental timing. 2 security guards flanked the man in the grey suit, their radios crackling softly against their chests. Dr. Hargrove stood at the far end of the ICU corridor with his arms crossed, his face wearing the expression of a man who'd just won something he didn't deserve. The investigator didn't introduce himself. He simply unfolded a prepared statement from his jacket pocket, the paper crisp and pristine, the words already written before he ever walked into Mercy General. Brooke's hand steadied as she understood what was happening. This wasn't investigation. This was execution. Registered Nurse Brooke Sullivan, the investigator read, his voice flat and procedural, "You are hereby suspended pending investigation into practicing medicine without proper authorization. You are required to surrender your badge and leave hospital property immediately." 20 staff members watched from doorways and the nurse's station. The observation was a weapon. The humiliation was the point. Brooke could feel their eyes like weight against her back, the same nursing staff who'd sat beside her in the break room just days ago, before Hargrove had made it clear that proximity to Brooke Sullivan was a career liability. Now they watched with the careful distance of people protecting themselves. Captain Sullivan exploded out of his father's room, his jaw locked with a kind of rage that only came from helplessness. "She saved his life. The hell is wrong with you people?" The investigator didn't even glance in his direction. "Sir, please return to the patient room. This is a personnel matter." Brooke reached for her badge, the laminated rectangle with her photograph from 7 years ago, a younger version of her face caught mid-blink, and unhooked it from her scrub pocket. The click of the plastic clip releasing sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She placed it carefully on the investigator's clipboard, her movements deliberate, controlled. But when her fingers released the badge, she felt them tremble. One tear escaped before she could stop it, sliding down her cheek like a small betrayal. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the investigator, the gesture so quick most people in the hallway missed it entirely. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but the hallway was so quiet that everyone heard every word. "The general's dressing needs changing in 4 hours. His oxygen should stay above 92%. Check the monitor settings, they're drifting high by about 3 points. He has a morphine allergy, not sulfite. And he needs the head of the bed elevated 45 degrees or the edema in his lower extremities will cause thrombosis complications." Medical instructions. Patient care. The only thing that had ever mattered to her, delivered to people who no longer had authority to hear them. Dr. Hargrove stepped forward, his movements sharp and predatory. He was savoring this moment, the moment he'd won. His voice dripped with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully removed a threat and painted himself as the protector of institutional order. "Always so heroic, aren't you, Sullivan? Playing combat medic. But you're not in the military. You're just a nurse. And now everyone knows it." Brooke turned to face him fully. One measured breath. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to see that she wasn't broken, wasn't diminished, wasn't anything less than she'd been 5 minutes before. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The deferential edge was gone. What remained was something harder. Something that had survived things Hargrove couldn't begin to comprehend. "I'm here to care for patients, doctor. Nothing more." The security guards moved toward her, not roughly, but with the bureaucratic momentum of a process already set in motion. One of them held the main elevator door open. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that sickly pale glow that only existed in hospitals and corporate offices, places where humanity went to be processed and filed away. Her shoes clicked against the linoleum as she walked toward the exit, the sound echoing down the corridor with the finality of a closing door. She didn't look back. The storm outside had intensified in the 8 hours since the blackout. Rain hammered against the parking lot in sheets, and the wind moved through the hospital's landscaping with the kind of violence that bent trees sideways. Brooke's scrubs were soaked through within 30 seconds of stepping outside, the fabric clinging to her ribs like cold skin. Her badge was gone. Her job was gone. The carefully constructed invisibility she'd been ordered to maintain had been shattered, and for what? So a man could sell more equipment than a hospital actually needed? She drove for 40 minutes in the rain, the wipers beating a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Norfolk in November at night was a maze of dark streets and closed storefronts. She pulled into Arlington West Memorial just after midnight, the small cemetery barely lit, the graves marked by temporary stones in neat geometric rows. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse, driven sideways by wind that smelled like salt water and diesel fuel from the naval base. She found David's marker without difficulty. She'd walked to it 1,000 times in her mind over the past 8 years, even when her body never left Brooke Sullivan's apartment or Mercy General's 4th floor. Master Sergeant David Sullivan, KIA Ramadi, 2015. The date was carved deep into the stone, as if the weight of those numbers required more permanence than anything else. She kneeled in the mud. Her hands pressed into the wet earth, and she stayed there, breathing, not moving, not speaking. The rain washed down her face, and she let it. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of water and wind and the distant sound of traffic on the highway beyond the cemetery gates. When her voice came, it was barely recognizable, not the quiet, deferential voice that had navigated Mercy General's hallways, not the commanding voice that had taken over in the blackout, but something in between. Something that had been fractured so many times that the breaks had become the architecture of who she was. "I tried to stay invisible like they wanted," she whispered. After Ramadi. After the op went sideways and the senators needed plausible deniability. "I disappeared. You were already gone, and they made sure the rest of me vanished too." Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, erased from the Pentagon's records like I'd never existed at all. The mud was in her fingernails now, under her cuticles, as real and present as the grief that had been her constant companion for 8 years. "I promised I'd never surface. I promised I'd stay invisible. No medals, no honors, no one asking questions about where I came from or what I'd done. Just Brooke the quiet nurse. Brooke the one nobody noticed." Her hands pressed deeper. "But I couldn't let another Marine die. Not your commanding officer. Not in front of your son." And now, her voice broke. The sound was small and hollow in the empty cemetery. "Now everyone knows it. Hargrove made sure of that. And they'll keep looking, keep digging, and they'll find the name the Pentagon spent 8 years trying to erase." She was crying now, not the single tear she'd let escape in the hallway, but something deeper and more destructive, tears that came from the places inside her that had been hollowed out by distance and duty and the terrible weight of coming home to a life where you couldn't be yourself. "I'm sorry," she said to the wet stone, to the man beneath it, to the version of herself that had died in Ramadi along with him. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay hidden. I'm sorry I failed us. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough to disappear when it matters." The rain fell harder, if such a thing was possible. The water pooled around her knees, soaking through her scrubs, mixing with the mud until she couldn't tell where the earth ended and she began. In the distance, she heard a car door slam. Headlights cut through the rain. Someone was here, in a cemetery at midnight in the middle of a November storm. But Brooke didn't look up. She stayed there, kneeling, hands in the mud, breathing the cold air that tasted like salt and despair. What she didn't know was that Captain Sullivan had followed her. What she didn't know was that he'd watched her walk out of Mercy General with her badge in the investigator's hands. What she didn't know was that he'd gotten her address from the employee directory and driven through the storm, following her here out of instinct, out of the same strange gravitational pull that had made him unable to look away from her competence, her precision, her quiet refusal to break. And what she absolutely couldn't know, not yet, was that he'd finally figured out why her maiden name on the employee file seemed to trigger something deep in his operational memory. Why her hands moved like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Why his commanding officer had whispered a single word, Reaper, like he was greeting a ghost. She was still on her knees in the mud when she heard the car door open. The rotor wash came first, a sound like a helicopter tearing the sky open, echoing across Mercy General's parking lot at 06 for 7 hours. Nurses stood frozen at the fourth-floor windows, watching the Black Hawk descend with military precision, its rotors pushing rain sideways across the asphalt. This wasn't a medical transport. This was something else entirely. 3 black SUVs arrived in formation behind the helicopter, their motorcade cutting through the Virginia morning like a knife. No sirens. No emergency lights. Just the quiet authority of men who didn't need noise to command attention. The hospital's administrative staff watched from the lobby windows as military personnel in dress blues emerged, moving with the fluid precision of professionals who had trained for this exact moment. Marine General James Cortez walked through Mercy General's entrance at 0651, a limp marking where the IED shrapnel had embedded itself into his femur 36 hours earlier. He shouldn't have been mobile. He shouldn't have been standing. But he moved forward anyway, flanked by a Force Recon colonel and a Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. The general's voice, when he spoke to the hospital administrator, carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his requests become commands within seconds. "I need to speak with a quiet nurse from the 4th floor." The room went dead silent. Hospital staff scrambled. Confusion rippled through the administrative wing like water over stone. The quiet nurse. Nobody knew which one he meant. There were 4 nurses on the 4th floor, and the general had been conscious for less than 18 hours. Security hesitated, uncertain whether to move or stand down, their eyes flickering between the general and the administrator who looked as though she'd swallowed gravel. Captain David Sullivan appeared at the top of the stairwell at 0656, his dress blues crisp, his face set with the particular expression of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen and can do nothing to stop it. He'd spent the last 24 hours in a military hospital, being briefed by NCIS and Pentagon intelligence, learning about the woman who'd raised him alone after Ramadi, learning about the call sign that had echoed through every forward operating base in Helmand Province for 3 consecutive deployments. Reaper. The combat medic who'd brought 37 Marines back from the edge of death using nothing but medical knowledge, a steady hand, and an absolute refusal to let anyone die on her watch. He'd heard the stories his entire childhood and never understood they were about his own mother. Brooke Sullivan walked out of the 4th floor medication room at 0658, her weathered hands holding a supply requisition form. She wasn't expecting visitors. She wasn't expecting anything anymore except the slow process of rebuilding a life from the ashes of a career that had been incinerated in front of 300 people and 4 news cameras. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot. She looked exactly like what she'd trained herself to become, invisible. The general's eyes locked on her face across the distance of 30 feet, and something shifted in the space between them. His breath caught. Recognition. Memory. Realization that the woman who'd saved his life, who'd held his collapsing lung steady in the darkness of a failed backup generator while screaming doctors and a predatory administrator tried to destroy her, was standing in front of him in faded blue scrubs and worn white shoes. He whispered a single word, and that word carried 8 years of classified operations, for congressional briefings, and the testimony of every single Marine who'd walked out of that Ramadi Field hospital alive. Reaper. The hallway froze. The general's entourage shifted, sensing the weight of what that name meant. Hospital staff began to understand, slowly, impossibly, that the quiet nurse they'd walked past 1,000 times in the break room, the one they'd avoided, the one they'd whispered about when Hargrove orchestrated her humiliation, was someone they'd never seen at all. Captain Sullivan moved forward in his dress blues, his voice breaking as he finally understood why his mother's hugs had always felt different, why she'd always been watching the news with a particular intensity when military operations were broadcast, why her hands could steady a child's fever at midnight or hold a fractured Marine's hand without flinching. He'd inherited her composure without understanding where it came from. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. It wasn't a greeting. It was a salute delivered in words, and Brooke's hands, those steady, scarred hands that had held lives together in a field hospital 8,000 miles from home, trembled for the first time in 8 years. Not from fear. Not from doubt. From recognition. From the moment she'd been erased finally being reversed. A Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit stepped forward and handed her a manila folder marked declassified across the top in red letters. Brooke's fingers opened it slowly, and inside were after-action reports in her own handwriting, pages she hadn't seen since 2015, words she'd written in blood-soaked notebooks under a canvas tent while incoming mortars shook the ground. Casualty charts with names of Marines who'd walked back to base because she'd refused to let them die. Medical procedures performed under fire. Decisions made in the space between 1 second and the next that had saved lives when the official answer was supposed to be that those lives were expendable. A barrel-chested Force Recon colonel stepped forward, his voice steady and precise, reading from a formal document that the room knew was changing everything in real time. Navy Cross. He paused. The silence stretched. First Bronze Star. Another pause. Longer this time. Second Bronze Star. He closed the document and held it against his chest. The weight of those 3 medals should have crushed her. Instead, she simply stood, her composure intact, her face showing nothing, the mask she'd worn for 8 years of hiding finally beginning to crack at the edges. Dr. Hargrove's face drained of color from where he stood in the back corner of the administrative wing. The man who'd thought he was untouchable, who'd built an empire on intimidation and fraud, suddenly understood that he'd chosen the wrong enemy. He'd tried to destroy a decorated Navy combat medic, and the full weight of military justice was walking toward him in dress blues. An FBI agent in a dark suit opened a laptop and projected financial records onto the conference room screen, duplicate equipment orders, phantom billing codes, kickback arrangements highlighted in screaming red. $3 million in fraudulent charges over 12 years. Commission payments from medical supply companies. Fabricated documentation. Everything. This investigation, the FBI agent announced, has been accelerated to active prosecution status by order of Military Intelligence Command. We have jurisdiction. We have evidence. We have sealed indictments waiting on a judge's signature. The general raised his hand and nodded to Captain Sullivan, who opened the conference room doors. The hallway was packed wall-to-wall, every nurse from the 4th floor, residents who'd frozen during the blackout, staff members who'd watched Hargrove's contempt with either complicit silence or quiet shame. 3 local news cameras set up in the back, their red lights blinking like predators sensing blood in the water. The general stood despite the pain in his leg, despite the fact that a full 24 hours ago he'd been gasping for air with a collapsed lung, and his voice carried to every corner of the hallway and beyond. This man built a career on intimidation and fraud. He tried to destroy a woman who saved my life. He called her nobody. He was wrong. Hargrove's voice rose, thin and desperate. This is a political move. I have connections. I have rights. I can explain. You tried to imprison a decorated combat veteran, the general said, his words cutting like scalpels, for saving my life. That's not a medical board issue anymore. That's federal. Security moved in, 2 guards taking Hargrove's arms. He struggled, his face red, his voice becoming shrill as he was escorted toward the doors. The crowd parted instinctively, the way people part for someone already dead, someone already erased from the universe of people who deserve air to breathe. You can't do this. I'll sue. His words dissolved into the sound of his shoes scraping against tile floor, into the mechanical click of the lobby doors, into the flash of news cameras outside capturing every moment of his disintegration. Dr. Hargrove, Chief of Emergency Medicine, 12 years of service, $3 million in stolen funds, was being walked out of Mercy General in handcuffs at 0724 on a Thursday morning with news cameras rolling. The cameras outside captured everything. The hospital's PR team would spend the next 72 hours in crisis management. By evening, the story was regional: Navy combat medic fired for saving general's life, hospital chief arrested for fraud. By the next morning, it was national. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, the decorated combat medic whose operation in Ramadi had been so classified that 3 senators had demanded her erasure, whose name had been removed from every official record, whose service had been buried so deep that her own son didn't know she'd earned a Navy Cross, was suddenly visible again. 6 months later, someone spotted Hargrove at a folding table outside a Virginia Beach strip mall, selling supplemental insurance policies. His medical license revoked. His bank accounts frozen. His career, everything he'd built on the backs of intimidated staff and defrauded patients, evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 18 months federal prison. Full restitution he'd never be able to pay. The medical board issued a statement about maintaining professional standards. The hospital issued a statement about zero tolerance for fraud. The general appeared on 3 television interviews talking about the importance of recognizing hidden heroes. But the real change came quietly. At Mercy General, the 4th floor ICU became the Sullivan Wing. The hospital director personally oversaw the renovation, updating equipment, training new staff, ensuring that every single nurse on that floor understood that their work mattered, that their presence was seen, that they would never be invisible. In the main lobby, a glass case appeared. Inside hung Brooke's weathered nursing jacket, the lining open deliberately to show the faded Ramadi unit patch she'd kept hidden for 8 years. The plaque read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, USN, Navy Cross, Bronze Star, 2, Purple Heart, 2, a 37 lives saved in combat, countless more in service. At the Pentagon, under a late afternoon sky turning amber and gold, Brooke Sullivan stood in dress white she hadn't worn since 2015, her hair down, her medals precisely arranged above her heart. The Secretary of Defense approached with the Navy Cross on its ribbon, the highest peacetime decoration the Navy could award, and the operation that had required her erasure, the Blackout in Ramadi that 3 senators had demanded buried, was finally, completely declassified. Her hands, when the Secretary pinned the cross on her chest, didn't shake. Captain Sullivan stood beside her in his marine blues, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw his mother, not as the quiet nurse who'd raised him alone, but as the warrior she'd always been. A young Navy corpsman approached Brooke nervously after the ceremony, asking about specific procedures, specific casualties, specific moments from Ramadi. She answered every question with the patience of someone who understood that remembering was part of the healing. The general, fully recovered from his IED wound, saluted her from the front row of observers. As the sun set over the Pentagon courtyard, Brooke stood alone for a moment at the memorial wall, her reflection visible in the polished stone. She whispered to her husband's name, etched among thousands, "I didn't fail us. I finally remembered who we were." The final image was her jacket in the Mercy General Hall of Honor, the Ramadi patch visible in the open lining, a handwritten note pinned beside it in Captain Sullivan's careful military script, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." If you've watched this far, you understand that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Subscribe for more stories about hidden heroes who finally get recognized. Like this video if you believe that service, real service, deserves to be seen. And comment, have you ever been completely wrong about someone? I want to hear your story.